Good afternoon, esteemed delegates, Your Excellencies, and the organizers of this conference, as well as the participants on the panel that have come before me. I apologize profusely that I will have to rush through my presentation because I know and I'm keenly aware that I'm standing between you and your lunch. So it will have to be rushed. There is a PowerPoint presentation that has been prepared, but in the interest of time, I'm prepared to merely talk, right? Is that fine? Okay. So to my program director, I am not running NEDLEC as he has announced. I am the convener, the overall convener for the business delegation at NEDLEC, which brings together the business community, the trade unions, the community structures, as well as government. So I lead the business delegation in that institution. And that's where I come from. So the topic that I need to talk to you about is ensuring effective public participation in the labor market and socio-economic policy and the legislative landscape. This obviously in the context of sustainable development as economic equity as already outlined. So I will be, and this is a disclaimer, I will be talking to you obviously solely from the perspective of South Africa and primarily the role of NEDLEC in what we're talking about. So one of the very first laws that the democratic government post-94 put into or brought into force was the NEDLEC Act. Now, NEDLEC stands for National Economic Development and Labor Council. So there is an act, it's a long name, there's an act to that effect, which came into effect in 1994. One of the objects of this act, or a few of the objects rather, is to promote the goals of economic growth, participation in economic decision-making, and social equity. It's also to seek consensus and reach agreements on social and economic policy matters. And the next two are also very important: to consider all proposed labor legislation relating to the labor market or labor market policy before it is introduced in Parliament, and to also consider all significant changes to economic policy before it's implemented or introduced in Parliament, right? So in that space, that being the framework, the NEDLEC Act, and in the context of what we're talking about here, so who are the important players? I believe it's the policymakers now. By that, I'm talking about right from government or the ministers or departments or their DGs or permanent secretaries through the chain to the parliamentarians who ultimately pass these policies into law. Okay. Then you've got in that chain, you also have who I refer to as policy shapers. Now, the policy shapers would be the members of the public, and specifically in our case would be NEDLEC and the NEDLEC partners who are there. These are the social partners that I refer to as organized business that I represent, is organized labor, is organized community or civil organizations, and then of course the government, right? But at NEDLEC, we're all equal, okay? So government is not coming to NEDLEC to say, this is how we are going to rule. They will have proposals about the types of policies that they want, and then engage the other social partners in on an equal footing in the process of trying to convince the social partners that their policies are good for the country. This obviously happens at NEDLEC after there has been public consultation, and sometimes public consultation also happens after NEDLEC, but the idea is you consult the public about what you feel is good for the country, then you go and test your policy proposals at NEDLEC which is a formalized negotiation structure. And out of that will emerge a package of agreements, or sometimes areas of concern or disagreements, which will then be given to the minister concerned to take to cabinet and ultimately be introduced in parliament, right? We see this as democracy at work. It's a very important institution, by the way, because it allows ordinary people who are not elected public officials to engage in the process of shaping policy or legislation. So it is democracy at work, and the members of the public also get an opportunity, not through NEDLEC, when they're invited to make comments on whatever the government ministers may be proposing. Okay. But the theme is, how do you make that effective, right? So I've spoken about NEDLEC. If there is a number of, as I believe it is, a number of South Africans in the audience, they will know this institution, and I'm glad that they're also members of the executive on the panel who also know this institution, and they also know their obligations in respect of NEDLEC and what they need to do when it comes to policy shaping or making. There are limitations to this process that I've outlined. Okay, NEDLEC is not the answer to all that we may want in respect of policy. Okay, and there are good reasons for that. Not everyone can be there. Otherwise, you just have the whole country being turned into, or NEDLEC becoming like I don't know, the old Imbizo type of thing where everybody is welcome. So it's not, it's representatives who are there, but these are selected from significant interests. So those who represent business would typically come from organizations that have got a national presence, that would speak for the majority of the business organizations in the country. Okay. And in this case, we have what an organization called Business Unity South Africa that represents business at NEDLEC. Trade unions, on the other end, we've got federations as well. Thank you. We've got federations that represent a number of affiliated unions, which would obviously, amalgamate eventually to that level, so that it is the top representatives who sit there. Community organizations as well are supposed to be those who have a national footprint. It's not just any civil organization that exists with a cause that would end up there, but it's those that would have a reach throughout the country and that have got a key national cause that they're pursuing. Okay. And then, of course, the government departments that impact labor legislation or policy, economic policy, and public finances, those are key there as well, right? So, but the question I ask, is it sufficient to only talk to NEDLEC? And I would posit that it is not. And that's where talking to the public and other organizations outside NEDLEC becomes key. We even have organized institutions representing workers or a business that are not necessarily represented at NEDLEC. Their voice matters too. And it is for government or the ministers that are seeking to introduce policy to seek out their voice before they can finalize any policy, because the policy or the law ultimately will apply to everyone, not only those who are members of the organizations represented at NEDLEC. And then you also have those who are unorganized. You have a number of, and here I believe the bulk of the audience from business point of view would be SMEs. Now, those small organizations are not necessarily or are not able to participate like big organizations would in forums like NEDLEC, for a number of good reasons. One, obviously you have to belong to a particular organization to get there. But typically they exist to pursue, to make money, to do whatever they're doing so that they can get ahead. Now, if you ask some of them to set aside some of their time to go and talk about policy at NEDLIC, that means days out of the office. It's not something that they can easily afford. So the result is that they are not able to participate as meaningfully as we perhaps would like. That's a challenge that we should not just say, well, what can we do? We've given them the opportunity. I believe it's up to the government, it's up to the organized business, it's up to the other structures to ensure that we actually have or devise more creative ways of sourcing the voice of those that are not in NEDLIC, the unorganized. Okay. And here I have a good example, for example, where we, as one of the commissions sitting in the Department of Labor that is responsible for making laws for particular sectors. Okay. There was one dealing with domestic workers. Instead of just sending out a notice and say, well, look, come, we want to talk about issues that affect you as domestic workers, you know very well that you're not going to get anyone coming to that meeting because where they are at work. Right? And they do not have, and the time that they get off, they have other responsibilities at home. So the department and the commission that was responsible for that had to come up with creative ways like channeling the messages to reach them, for example, through community radio stations or pamphlets or leaflets that they could drop off at taxi ranks where they would reach as many as possible of the domestic workers, just to let them know what it is that government is trying to propose for them, and also give them information about if they have the ability to channel some of their comments back to the policymakers. It was an attempt, a creative one at that, but we're not saying that it is adequate, but the call is certainly that there are ways and there is indeed a need to reach out to those who are unorganized, and that applies to small businesses as well as to workers. There's also the informal sector. Okay, now the informal sector, the ILO estimated in 2016 that the informal sector accounted in sub-Saharan Africa alone for 41% of the GDP of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And it also accounted for 72% of the employment rates in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, how do you reach those people when you're trying to make laws that will affect them? It's a challenge. Right? How much time do I have? 2 minutes. All right. So, what is it that can be done in this particular case to ameliorate the position that we obviously have identified as a major challenge? There is something called in government. There's a very innovative system. It's called Socio-Economic Impact Assessment System. That is led by an interdepartmental team of officials of the key ministries. The idea is that every policy proposal should be presented to this team first, before it's even taken to NEDLIC or to the public, to assess what is the socio-economic impact of this policy if we go ahead with it. Is it going to be good for jobs? Is it going to be good for the economy? And all those considerations. If they tick all of that, meaning they're satisfied that it's a good policy, then it's ready to be recommended for consultation through the system. But if they fail that test, that it is bad for the economy or it's bad for jobs or whatever, then it should not proceed. Right? And that's the idea. Unfortunately, it is not being applied consistently, and that's a missed opportunity, we think, from our government. Right? If it was done properly, it would certainly ensure that a lot of the laws that we see have got the right reach, the right design, and the impact is what we're looking for. The parliamentary process, once it is left NEDLIC, is also another opportunity where parliamentarians can also embark on a process of public consultations to reach those that would otherwise not have been reached. It can certainly be done better, we believe, especially in the context of what we have said about those that are not organized. Right? Those are not, in fact, to call for public participation or presentations in Cape Town for a law that affects someone in Polokwane, and a small business or an unorganized worker actually boggles the mind how you expect them to get there in the first place, right? So they also, and I'm finishing. Okay, we believe there are some cautions as well here. Okay, that our government in particular, and also the parties like us, need to always hold up. Policy incoherence or uncertainty is a big problem. President Mahama spoke of, for example, the need to allow for free movement of people, of goods, of services. Okay? That's all good and well, and it's a statement that our leaders at summits would sign up to and say Africa should do that. Then they take it down to their ministries and say, this is what we'd like to do. Now you have the Department of Home Affairs that says, my mandate is to make sure that I control the borders of who comes in, who goes out. Okay? You have the training, the DTI, for example, with a mandate to try and make investment or South Africa an investment-friendly country, right? Where are the people that have got the money? Some of them are outside, and you're trying to get them into the country. They can't get visas, right? Because of the departments are not talking to each other, right? And at the same time, you also have the Department of Labor, which has got a different mandate about, and they sometimes see their role as protecting the workers here internally, right? Which is often at the expense of bringing skilled labor from outside to come and enrich what we have here. So we see that as a big problem, and it is not, so a policy incoherence or uncertainty or just disjointed is destructive to actually the ultimate goals that, that as government we may be having as a vision, right? And we feel also, this is my second last point, that policy is often is playing catch-up. Right? There's often a disconnect between policy and reality. So we know that what's called Industry 4.0, or the fourth industrial revolution as some call it, is upon us. It's not something that is coming in the future. But we still have laws that are regulating working arrangements as if we are 20 or 30 years ago, right? So that is basically defying reality. The result is that people work outside the system because that's the reality that they're in. And so there's a need, and I'm not suggesting that policy should be prospective and in anticipating what's likely to happen. But certainly that's the space that we would expect our officials to be playing in anticipating what's coming down the line and be flexible enough with the policy arrangements to accommodate the changing world we're in. Right? And it would apply to collective bargaining arrangements, which I believe personally are stuck in the 60s. The working arrangements that we have, which do not support or are not supported by the reality of the fourth industrial revolution. We also, and finally, political alliances that sometimes undermine the good work that's being done. Right? So you could have your structures at NEDLEC that negotiate and come to some sort of agreements, take it to Parliament, and then because of the political alliances that we sometimes have, some changes are made, which undermine the integrity of the consultative process in the first place. And it perpetuates the uncertainty of policy that we've been talking about. And I could go on and on and on about some of these things, but I'm quite mindful that I'm stressing you out and your stomachs are beginning to grumble. So on that note, I shall ask to take leave. Thank you.